And we're going to kick things off with Jon Hoekstra. Jon is currently Vice President and Chief Scientist at the World Wildlife Fund. Until relatively recently, he had a pretty long stint at the Nature Conservancy, where he was a senior scientist and where he was one of the people at TNC who really was breaking ground and thinking about global conservation. Jon's also obviously a master of concise communication there with his title. But that really speaks very succinctly to what he's been thinking about over the last several years. With that, I will turn things over. Speakers will have 30 minutes to speak and then 5 minutes for questions for the first couple talks. And let's welcome Jon Hoekstra.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Walter, for having me here, and thank you all for coming out. Walter tried to shoehorn me into some very narrow subject matter today. So given the breadth of space that title allows me, what I thought I would do today is just share some thoughts, kind of my brief history of global conservation, just look at where I see the arc having been and where I see the arc going in terms of global conservation, and do it with a little bit of an eye towards our topic of spatial biodiversity science. So with that, let me dive in. 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to meet Stuart Brand, who was one of the leaders of the environmental movement really a generation ago. And one of the things that he's famous for is getting credit for this photograph being released. This is really one of the very first photos of Earth from space. And it was taken in 1968, and when it was released to the public, it served as a real kind of a rallying symbol for the environmental movement. It was really the first time that humans had gotten to see their planet in that perspective and get to see it as a whole. Of course, we didn't really know that much about the planet back then. We were able to see it in a photograph, but we weren't able to see it in detail from a scientific and data-driven perspective. But I think that really kicked off at least thinking about global conservation. We saw the Earth as a whole. We had this notion that there was a global situation in play, and I think that started us on our trajectory. After that, one of the things that came up and remains vitally important for global conservation today are red lists. So the IUCN manages the red list of threatened species. This is the compilation of kind of the names and the status of species that we're worried about going extinct. Increasingly has spatial resolution to it, but at the beginning it really was a list. This trend in data aggregation continued, and this is the theme, I guess, of the early parts of global conservation, was really going from that first picture to aggregating data about the state of the world. And an important moment came when Eric Dinerstein and other colleagues at World Wildlife Fund delineated the terrestrial ecoregions of the world. This reflected a really grand compilation of data about the ecological systems, the communities of species, and they delineated essentially these ecological neighborhoods of the world, and it gave us, for the first time, a framework around which to organize global conservation. So instead of having to rely on political boundaries for which nature is happily ignorant and pays no attention, we now have some ecological neighborhoods that do have some meaning for nature, and it gives us a powerful framework for organizing our thinking, organizing our science around global conservation. And that led to an explosion of global prioritization efforts. So this is from a 2006 paper by Tom Brooks and colleagues at Conservation International, but these are 9 different kind of independently derived global prioritization schemes. The one top center, Biodiversity Hotspots, is the one that Conservation International is famous for. It reflects places in the world where there are lots and lots of endemic plant species, and there's been lots of habitat loss. 1,500 plant species per region and more than 70% habitat loss. The upper left are crisis ecoregions. That was a paper I was involved with. Those are places where habitat loss is high and habitat protection is low, and one would therefore be worried about the ecological systems unraveling. Just other examples, frontier forests, bottom middle. These are kind of the last, and last to the wild in this lower right. These are kind of the biggest expanses of habitat representing each biome in each realm of the world. So all these are different schemes that reflect data that were compiled by various NGOs with academic partners on the richness of species, on the rarity of species, on the uniqueness of the communities of species, et cetera. And depending on the values that were applied, the criteria that were chosen by the different organizations, we generated this amazing diversity of prioritization schemes, which in aggregate represent about 80% of the world, underscoring the fact that depending on who you ask, their part of the world is generally going to be considered important to them. But this was a big deal in global conservation, and pretty much every big conservation organization had a map, built a map, used that to sort of establish their scientific bona fides. And it was an exciting time, but it was very selective outtakes. So then an interesting thing started to happen, and I'm going to be a little self-serving in this regard. A couple years ago, several colleagues at the Nature Conservancy and I published this book, The Atlas of Global Conservation. The second author, Jen Molnar, is a Yale alum, worked with Dave Skelly. This book reflects the science that the Nature Conservancy used to figure out its global priorities. So my job at TNC was to help them figure out where they should be working around the world, what their global priorities should look like. We made that crisis ecoregions map, although that didn't get stamped as the priority set, but rather we gathered up lots of information that was provided to decision makers, and they made a variety of decisions internally, but we realized that we had compiled this amazing collection of data. We worked with more than 70 institutions around the world to gather more than 100 global data sets about where biodiversity was distributed, what its status was, how threats were distributed around the world, and how conservation was being allocated around the world. And rather than try to process it into an answer, we thought, wouldn't it be great to put it out there? So we published this book, which 2 years later feels rather antiquated, to be honest, because all this stuff has gone digital. I think next we're going to hear from Walter about the Map of Life project, which is an example of how these kinds of global data sets are really coming to life. And we saw talks earlier today that reflected the same. But in this kind of first sweep of global conservation, what I saw was lots of effort in data aggregation and developing these pictures of the state of the world. We then entered, in the last few years, kind of a middle phase that to me, from a science and data perspective, is about using all these aggregated data and starting to process it, starting to juxtapose it in interesting ways to reveal new insights into some of the challenges and the solutions for conservation. One of the trends that was happening in global conservation at the time was a scaling up, seeking to undertake ever larger and larger projects. So that ecoregion framework that Eric Dinnerstein helped draw out gave us a way to imagine, wow, we don't want to just conserve a place here and a place there. We want to conserve entire regions. And so people started to imagine projects like the Great Bear Rainforest, which is protecting 25 million acres along the coast of British Columbia, or the Coral Triangle Initiative that's trying to span across 6 countries and protect the world's most diverse coral region. So this is a figure from a paper out of Paul Armsworth's lab in Tennessee, and a lot of attention has been paid on the left. This is fee simple habitat acquisition in the U.S. On the right, it's conservation easements, if you like the details. It's time along the x-axis. It's logarithmic size on the y. So if you just follow the top line on that figure, sorry, let me use my laser pointer instead of my finger. If you just follow the top line of this spread, there has been a really significant increase from 100 hectares to 10,000 hectares to 1 million hectares in size. So conservation has been undertaking larger and larger and larger projects, and that's been a big theme in global conservation. But remember that that spread is really large. There's no shortage of small conservation efforts still out there. Another trend in thinking about global conservation using these data was to start to juxtapose kind of the biodiversity information with information on things like cost and think about conservation return on investment. So this is a paper by Bill Murdoch and company looking just at Argentine grasslands as a case, and they combined data about what sorts of biodiversity you'd protect if you picked different locations across Argentina, but they also factored in cost. And so this is just a nice figure that shows 3 different ways of approaching conservation priorities. On the left, if you try to just maximize benefits, that's the classic just go where the species richness is higher kind of approach, no matter what the cost. You get this kind of distribution, all these little blue dots scattered around Argentina. That's what you would protect if you wanted to just maximize benefit without respect to cost. If you wanted to just be cheap and minimize the cost of conservation, you'd go and you'd buy up a big chunk of habitat. That must be the least desirable real estate in Argentina. But you'd go there. And then if you're clever, as Hugh Possingham would say, not stupid, Hugh Possingham would call you not stupid by doing this, you'd use return on investment. And you would take a ratio, and there are different algorithms for taking a ratio of the benefit you get and the cost that you impose, and you get a third very different sort of allocation of resources and a different picture of conservation. And there's a lot of interesting work by Hugh Possingham, by Bill Murdoch, and others factoring in this cost factor. And I think, again, this is kind of this middle trend in global conservation, trying to figure out how do we take this limited pool of money that we will always have, it's going to be a limited pool, and how do we make the most of it? A third trend that has started to come up in the last few years is juxtaposing biodiversity information with other sorts of data related to human interests, economic benefits, or ecosystem services. So this is a clip out of a recent paper by Will Turner at Conservation International. And the top panel is an index of ecosystem service value. It reflects water, pollination, soil, carbon, and carbon factors heavily in the distribution of colors here. Yellow is greater ecosystem service value, blue is less. And then juxtapose that with the level of threatened endemism. So as an index of conservation value in a biological sense, they mapped what's the percentage of threatened species that are endemic. And then they juxtaposed and they played little statistical games about how much benefit to people you'll get if you conserve things for biodiversity, and you could imagine playing it the other way. So there's been a lot of energy around starting to link up conservation and other sorts of human-centered values. And then the last trend that I've started to see in global conservation is really paying attention to climate change. So this is a figure that the Audubon Society put out through the Associated Press. They had a report on birds and climate change in North America. And this figure uses Christmas bird count data to measure the shift in winter ranges of a number of species. So the way you look at it, here's the rufous-sided towhee. Which dot is that? I think it might be this one. Its kind of winter center of gravity used to be here in Arkansas, and now it's over here in western Kansas. The Virginia rail has moved from New Mexico up to Utah, Sellers J from Oregon to Washington, et cetera. So we're starting to see global conservation go from, to me, this figure has 2 meanings. One, we're going from sort of static mapping of how biodiversity is distributed and comparing it to things like cost and human benefits and the like, a lot of static mapping, to now we're starting to ask how biodiversity is changing as a function of climate change. So I think it's very, very important. And that, to me, shifts us into where global conservation is heading. Climate change is going to be something that global conservation is going to have to wrestle with. Economic development is going to have to wrestle with. Humanitarian aid is going to have to wrestle with. Human health is going to have to wrestle with. So it's very important that we start paying attention to it, and we're going to actually need to do more than just understand how biodiversity might move around as a result of climate change. We're going to have to start really confronting issues of how do we mitigate climate change through things like preventing and avoiding deforestation, changing our energy consumption. We're also going to have to think about adaptation. So maybe this isn't a big deal. In fact, when I first Googled looking for this image, it was in a skeptic's blog who was trying to call out that, hey, a lot of these species are actually doing quite well. That's actually fine. What we're going to have to pay attention to is we need to know not only how things are moving, how are they changing in abundance, and what sorts of adaptation interventions might that require from a conservation perspective. If there are linkages between biodiversity and human benefits, and climate change is shifting the productivity of those systems. What is that going to mean from an adaptation perspective if things like sea level rise are causing people to move inland? What kind of ramifications is that going to have, et cetera? So we're going to need to really be paying attention to biodiversity data in a much more dynamic sense in the future so that we can be detecting and using our understanding of change to modify our conservation interventions. Another tidbit about data that I think is forthcoming, and I actually felt badly having this in my presentation after having the Encyclopedia of Life and the eBird presentations, much better examples of what I wanted to make at this point. This is a clip from a website. It's called Moabi. This is an application that World Wildlife Fund has developed, and the purpose of it is to create a mobile-based, social networked platform for citizens to monitor deforestation, legal and illegal, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the idea here is that there's a lot of stuff that we can do in terms of satellite monitoring and such with forests, but you also need boots on the ground. And conservation groups will never have as many boots on the ground as just communities will. And so we're trying to empower these communities to be part of their own monitoring. So Moabi is meant to be a platform that allows that sort of democratization of data. And so this is where this history of aggregation, which was great for all of us scientists that like to crunch those numbers, now needs to turn to a future of disaggregation, where we want to gather information together and then be able to deploy it out. And I think eBird is a great example of the power that we saw in the talk this morning of the aggregation part of the data. But then I've also got, oops, wrong pocket. They've got two mics on me today. On my phone, I have an iBird app that taps into the eBird system, and so I can hop on here and find out what birds have been seen around Yale in the last couple of weeks. That's terrific, that sort of disaggregation of data out to users in a format that they're interested in real time. That sort of power, I think, is going to be really important for global conservation in the future as more and more people want to tap into global perspectives even as they continue to make local interventions. So now let me turn into a little bit more of an unknown future. One of the things we're going to be confronting in the coming decades. So 40 years ago, we got our first look at the world whole. Today we can see it in pretty remarkable detail, thanks to satellites, thanks to the sorts of data aggregation efforts that we've undertaken. 40 years from now, we are going to have solved some really profound problems. And so this figure is meant to highlight those. The green line is kind of where we're at, just in a unit way. By 2050, we're going to add 2 billion people to the planet, más o menos. We're going to need to increase food production by 70%. We're going to need to increase or meet energy demands that are expected to grow 45, maybe even 50%. And we're going to have to somehow meet water demands that are going to grow by 55%. These are really profound challenges. Again, not just for conservation, but for development, for humanitarian interests, for health interests, et cetera. So in one generation, we've gone from really being able to see the Earth for the first time. We've got only 40, well, in fact, we've got 38 years, less than 40 years, to figure out how we're all going to live on this planet and how we're going to take as much nature with us as possible. So I put that up there just to underscore the nature of that challenge. And it's going to be a challenge that brings forward issues of resource scarcity. And again, this is going to go beyond the conservation circles, which I actually think is a good thing. So it's no longer going to be us sort of lonely waving the flag of, hey, we're losing things on the planet. Shouldn't society get behind us and help save it? It's all going to become a lot more real. When it has to do with food, water, and energy, people are going to find some interest there, and we have an opportunity to find common ground to work out how are we going to bring nature along through what's going to be a pretty tight bottleneck on this planet in the next 38 years. And it's going to change our picture. So think back to that ecoregions map. That was a really beautiful map that, by the way it was colored, made you think of, and it was meant to represent kind of all the great nature you find all over the world. Every single part of the land was covered. There are actually also freshwater ecoregions and marine ecoregions. So we painted this picture in conservation that was sort of wall-to-wall nature. But the reality is that it's not wall-to-wall nature. We saw again in the eBird, one of those videos, I love that you could see city centers where the birds weren't. That was really cool. It's not wall-to-wall nature, and again, this image is meant to remind us of that. These are the anthropogenic biomes. So instead of having tundra and temperate forests and temperate grasslands and tropical forests, which sort of underpinned the ecoregions map, this is a map that Naveen Ramankutty developed with some colleagues. These are the anthropogenic biomes, and we have wildlands over here in the upper right, these sort of nice pale green colors that show up in the high latitudes. We've got forests in the green and rangelands in sort of tan, but then all of a sudden we get into croplands, villages, and urban settings, and there's a lot of those kind of left-hand colors on the world today. And so I think it's going to be interesting to take the biodiversity information we have, the spatial data we have, and begin to understand how much biodiversity goes with some of these totally new kinds of systems that are out there. And can we manage those systems in a way that they keep as much biodiversity as possible? So that even though the world is going to look like this from a delineation perspective, can we layer in as much biodiversity as possible? So I'll close just with few other remarks that I hope will be a little bit provocative and spur some questions and discussion with the rest of our time. And that is that we're at a moment that I call the pivot for global conservation. And the pivot is playing out over a few years, but it is a moment, I think, where we're moving from a field that essentially looked backwards to a past state that we were quite confident of, hence the exclamation point. So we would look back, maybe it was 1850, maybe it was 1900, maybe it was 1700s, but we would look backwards to a previous state that we could document through historical records and say, that's what we should have. We're now pivoting to a much more forward-looking posture in conservation, and we're looking into a very uncertain future. We know that things are changing. We know we're going to have more people. We're going to have fewer resources. We're losing biodiversity. Climate is changing all around us. So we don't know how that's going to play out, but it's going to challenge us to think about how are we going to shape that future. We have entered the Anthropocene. It is going to be a geological era defined by people. And the good news is that we are those people. So we have a chance to shape this era. And that's what I think conservation's big challenge is in this pivot. And so it's going to challenge us to become forward-looking. Because we don't know exactly where we're going, we don't know exactly what the world is going to look like, we're going to shift from thinking about what to conserve and where to conserve as our priorities, and we're going to think about how to conserve. So we're going to start prioritizing the problems. What are the big challenges in front of us? And I think they're going to have to do with confronting resource scarcity. How are we going to feed, water, and fuel 9 billion people and still take a lot of conservation along with us? Start breaking that down. Those are going to be the challenges that we need to confront, as opposed to here are our hotspots, here are our global 200 ecoregions. We're also going to need to start thinking about nature and thinking about conservation of nature in a much more dynamic way. So again, we can't just use some historic state, a snapshot of the past, as our benchmark that we're trying to go back to. We're going to have to be trying to create a system that's going to be moving underneath our feet. So between the activities of people across the planet and climate change, we're on kind of unsteady footing, and we're going to have to use every bit of science we can to understand how things are changing, stay on our toes, be nimble, and be dynamically adjusting our conservation work, again, to carry as much biodiversity with us into the future. We're also going to, I think, be challenged to evaluate our work not in terms of what we haven't lost, but in terms of the kind of the outcomes we've really achieved. So it may be a wonky point, but I think conservation is going to be challenged to not just say, hey, that was great, this species didn't go extinct yet, which is usually how we play to our next round of funding. But I think we're going to have to say, here's a problem, we're going to help solve it. Here's the intervention that we took, here's the outcomes that we achieved. And those outcomes are going to have to be both in terms of the biodiversity that we've helped secure and keep healthy and productive and abundant, but also in the benefits that we deliver to people when they're expecting some sort of mutualism there. And then 2 more points. Touched on this already. I think that this future is going to push conservation squarely to an intersection with business, with humanitarian interests, with development interests, with health interests. And to me, it's a really exciting thing. So the days of saving conservation from nature are over. This saving nature for people is not meant to be like a fuzzy, we're all now in it for people and we're not in it for nature thing anymore. But I think it's really going to rest on this issue of how do we maintain a planet that is productive enough to feed 9 billion people, that sustains the sort of natural systems that we need to provide clean water, productive soils, healthy fisheries, et cetera. So I think that conservation has a real role to play, and we need to start spelling that out. Like, what is the role of conservation for the future of the planet and the needs of people that they're going to be trying to meet? And then last, I think that we're going to go from that sense that conservation was getting bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of that scaling up. I think if you think back to that figure from Paul Armsworth's paper, there will always be lots of kind of small conservation, if you will. I think that the future of global conservation is going to be in achieving global impact through distributed interventions. And that's where I think the kind of the democratization, the disaggregation of data is going to be really, really important, because we need to go from having a relatively limited number of conservation groups doing their damnedest to do what they can for the planet. We are going to need to rebuild an environmental movement that is waning, rebuild it so that more and more people, whether because they care about nature or because they care about some other interest that nature helps support, they're out helping protect it in their communities, and we need to make sure they have the science they need. And that includes businesses that are right now very much aware of the resource scarcity issues. They're worried about it for their future competitiveness. They're worried about it for their future viability in business. And so there is a window for us to take conservation science into some whole new arenas and help answer that question mark of what's that future going to look like 40 years from now. So I'll stop there and welcome some questions.
So Jonathan has been a moderator's dream, and there's plenty of time for questions.
So I think I know the answer to this one, but I find it quite curious that the food production has to go up by 70%, while the population only goes up by less than 30%. Mm-hmm. So where does that disparity come from?
Yeah, that disparity comes from more of the 7 billion people that we have today and the 9 billion people we're going to have in a few years wanting to live like you and I. It's change in diet. It's a change in consumption. As we bring more and more people out of poverty, they're going to want to eat more food, and they're going to want to eat more meat, and that's going to drive the production.
It seems like an obvious target, that big difference for doing something about it, in terms of trying to change people's lifestyles. Mm-hmm. Not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that sounds really popular.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the presentation, and I firmly agree that question mark is a key issue for us. Globally and nationally, and wonder, I didn't hear explicitly a deep mention of ecosystem services or decision support tools that could support either local decision making or more regional decision making, or potentially looking at that at the continental scale. What do you see as, if you were looking at that crystal ball of I think not being stupid.
Yeah.
What do you see there in terms of the viability of really working in that system of decision support around ecosystem services?
I think you're going to see a lot of it. It actually makes me think, there's an omission in terms of thinking of adding that into the debt. With things like the Natural Capital Project, it's Stanford and the University of Michigan building tools that frame up ecosystem service trade-offs between different development options. You can make that spatially explicit. You can start to link that with, data is a big driver there in terms of how precise you can be. That's an example. There are, in the business sector, where businesses that depend on water, that depend on agricultural commodities, are starting to recognize, hey, the world's finite out there. We need to make sure that we have a secure supply chain if we want to stay in business. They're starting to think about it. It's driving sectors in beef and palm oil and soy to think about voluntarily adopting standards, sustainability standards in terms of how they produce their commodities. And one of the things they factor in are high conservation value areas. which turns out is wickedly hard to map and come to terms with, because if you think back to that list of all those different global priorities, you've got to go reconcile all those different values of what's important. But the question is being asked. What are the places that we should protect because of their conservation value? What are the places we should protect because of their ecosystem services value? Questions being asked, so we have a tremendous opportunity to be answering it. And decision support tools tailored to those groups are going to be part and parcel with it.
Time for one more question?
Well, following up on that, you had was it 9 maps of the global priorities? Well, what happens if you combine all 9 and you show the ones that, you show in red everything that appears on all 9, and then you go down through your colors till you get to the ones that appear only on one?
Yeah.
What happens when you aggregate them that way? What does it look like?
You still end up with a lot of the world colored and in a tussle over whose values should reign supreme. So I don't have the slide in my deck, but I think Tom even did this in this paper. They lumped it up. So there are some places that come out, and they come out as really iconic places like the Amazon, like Indonesia, like the Congo Basin, and you can just kind of eyeball it. They come out as some of the really iconic biodiverse places in the world, so that's not too surprising. But I think that if you actually limited conservation to those areas, we would first of all lose huge amounts of biodiversity in the rest of the world, and we would probably undermine a lot of the services that people that live in lots of those other places depend on. So I personally don't find it all that instructive, even though I contributed to one of these maps. I think that this is not what we need to pay attention to in the future. We really need to figure out, somebody lives in almost all those places and they're going to care about it. We need to help them figure out how to conserve those places as best they can, whether it's one of my priorities, one of your priorities, or someone else's priorities.
That you spoke very interestingly about the democratization of these efforts and cell phones. So, if people are up, what is the incentive for people to keep uploading information, and to whom are they uploading it, and what is done with it when it's uploaded? And does Moabi have answers to all those questions? How does this work?
Yeah.
And is that a real way forward?
I think it is a real way forward. What we're struggling with Moabi, quite frankly, is how do we bring value to the users on the cell phone end so that they've got the incentive to put something up there, and how do we reflect their data back to them in a way that adds to that? I think eBird to me is a great example of getting on the right page with birders. I love it because I can pull it up and see what's birding. So it's giving me some value that really has nothing to do with the analyses that Steve showed us, but it enables those analyses by creating the incentives. I think that's the challenge. The health sector is doing the same thing. I'm going to a meeting in a month and a half to talk about how this same kind of technology is getting applied in the health sector. So I think we're going to be able to learn some lessons and maybe draw on those. But it's all going to be about providing value and adding value to people to contribute and come back. But I figure if people are willing to write reviews on Amazon, and there's loads of examples of people willing to put information forward because they're getting something valuable back, we need to tap into that. I think, yep.
Thanks.
Thank you all very much, and I'll be happy to take some more questions over the cocktails.